Welcome to the Mission Shaped Podcast. This is the Author's Take, a stream where we listen to authors unpack some of the nuances of their books related to the movement.
So welcome to another one of our author conversations. It's really good that you're able to join us for this. And joining me are Ed Olsworth-Peter and Leslie Newton. Let me introduce myself and then I'll introduce our guests today. I'll let them introduce themselves. So my name is Simon Goddard. I lead on resourcing at Fresh Expressions here in the UK. I'm a local practitioner involved in some nature-based fresh expressions of church. I'm a Baptist minister and work 2 or 3 days a week with Fresh Expressions. And I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself first, Ed. Good to see you again. Tell us a little bit, for those who are watching or listening, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here. I'm Ed Olsworth-Peter. My role is I'm Director of Innovation at St. Mellitus College, which is an Anglican theological college. But I've been ordained in the Church of England for about 20 years. I was an ordained pioneer, led Fresh Expressions, and was part of the Fresh Expression UK national team with Simon and others, as well as heading up pioneer ministry for the Church of England.
I'm Leslie Newton. I'm a Methodist district chair at the moment, living in York. And as part of my role, I'm on the FX board and have been for the last couple of years, and also serve as co-chair of the Methodist New Places for New People guiding team, which is trying to stimulate a ministry of fresh expressions within the Methodist Church. And just over a year ago now, I wrote a book which was a reflection on our early Methodist story and how I believe it has so much to inspire and teach us about how the Methodist movement can play its part within the wider church in terms of renewing the church for spiritual and social transformation.
Thank you for introducing yourselves. And this was we're specifically talking about the Mixed Ecology book that you've written, Ed, and based on Leslie's book and his experience in the Methodist Church. We thought it'd be a really good conversation about mixed ecology, or I think you use the language, Leslie, in your book of blended ecology of church. So it'd be really good to start our conversation there. And it'd be good just in terms of those perhaps struggling us to don't know what we're talking about with the mixed ecology. If you could tell us a little bit. Oh, I think I'm back. Sorry, technical problems here. So if you could tell us a little bit about what you mean by mixed ecology, but also tell us a little bit about the process of writing a book, because I think you took quite an interesting approach to this.
Yeah, so within the Church of England, we use the language now of mixed ecology, but that's been on a whole journey over the last sort of 10, 15 years of mixed economy, then the blended church we talked about a little bit, and then we've sort of landed on mixed ecology, I think because of the nice sort of natural analogies that are quite helpful within the pioneer world as well. And really, it kind of uses the idea of ecosystem, so seeing different types of churches, different ways of being church as an ecosystem. So rather than sort of just being side by side, they're interconnected in some way, whether they're aware of that or not. And I wrote the book out of probably sort of 10 years of teaching and thinking about the mixed ecology and different roles that I've had. And along the way, had some really interesting conversations with people, some who are theologians, some practitioners, some had sort of oversight roles. So in writing the book, I had something I wanted to say, but I also wanted to bring in the little nuggets that I've heard from other people to kind of get their views to sort of make it a slightly broader conversation as a book.
Great. I was surprised when I got the copy of it recently. I think I've forgotten. I think this process of writing the book, it takes a little while, doesn't it, to write a book? And I've forgotten that I was involved in it. I was surprised to see my name when I was flicking through the pages. I think I was involved in one of those conversations. So it's good to do that. So let me start the conversation because I think you've got a really helpful framework in the book based around, I think it's 5 chapters. And so the first question you ask is why a mixed ecology? And so, yeah, that might be a really good place to start. But why should the church adopt a mixed ecology approach to the way it does mission and ministry?
There's two ways you can look at that question. So there's the mixed ecology as recognizing the different expressions of church that are around. And there's why mixed ecology for some people who feel they want to grow their own local mixed ecology. So they have an inherited or time-honored expression of church, something that's already there. And they're also wanting to start a fresh expression of church or church plant. So you can hold those two things. But I think generally, I found myself writing, well, the why is because it already exists. It's already there. So in a way, we're catching up with what's been growing. And I know if you think about the fresh expressions movement in the UK, certainly sort of 5 years ago, we used to say that 75% of fresh expressions were birthed out of an existing church of some kind. Normally where lay people had seen a need to do something new alongside the existing church, but creating something that was church in its own right. And that is an example of a mixed ecology. So I think it's already there. It's the first thing I'd say. I think the other why is important is because actually there's so much that could be done, and more that could be done if we work together a little bit more and break down some of the barriers. It doesn't mean we all have to be the same. I think the difference is vital to this ecosystem. But actually, if we just work in our own little echo chambers, we may well have something that is easy for us to give to someone else that could be the making of their expression of church in any direction. And I know Mike Moyner, who I chatted to a lot as well in writing this book, often talked about a mixed ecology mobilizing people. It can inspire each other, but also gives people agency. And I think lastly, it helps people to see their own identity. Some people aren't just a bit part in the work of the church, or they're not the sort of mavericks to the edge, or the seemingly mainstream that isn't exciting in the middle, which is not the case at all. Everyone's got their part to play. We need everyone to do everything in that sense.
Yeah, that's great. And one of the bits of language that come out in the book, which I've heard you using it in the past, and I tend to use it now, partly because it offers this positive expression of what is already there. So I know I've used the word inherited church sometimes, and people have heard that in a negative way, but you use the phrase time-honored ways of being church, which I think is really, really positive and encouraging. And also, interestingly, in that question of why mixed ecology, you talk about this framework, sort of with two axes. Do you mind just telling us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's a tiny, very quick story within that. So in Diocese of Ely, when I was working there, I don't know how many years, like maybe 10 years ago, we were developing a sort of scale of, in that language, inherited and pioneering, just noticing the churches that were going on. And then the Pioneer Spectrum was published, CMS, Tina Hodgett and Paul Bradbury. And at the time, we were like, oh no, they beat us to it. There were on similar thoughts. It was much better than what we were developing. So it's fantastic they did that. And that's gone around the world. But as I used it a lot in working with local churches, particularly, who weren't necessarily planting or pioneering, they often say, well, where are we on this spectrum? We love what it's saying, but we don't, we're not pioneering something, we're not planting. So if you take the Pioneer Spectrum as a sort of horizontal axis, maybe something attractional at one end and something contextual at the other, in the book I'm suggesting a vertical axis that crosses it, where you've got, I call legacy and founding. So the top of the axis, the highest point would be legacy. So something already exists, something rich is already there. And founding at the bottom where nothing exists yet, it's yet to be formed. And if you put the two axes together, I think you could plot pretty much any expression of church in that world. And the last thing I'd say is that there's no sort of hard edge around the axis. I think it can stretch as far as it wants to, because as things develop and grow, they're going to change over time.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, in all of this, I want to encourage people to go out and buy the book, because we can only sort of do a little bit of justice to these themes that come out in the book in our conversation. And so I'll freshexpressions.org.uk/shop. You can access the book there. Leslie, as we hear Ed talk about that first chapter, why mixed ecology, you got any thoughts or responses to what Ed said?
Well, we're singing from the same hymn sheet, I think, absolutely. I think my observation from our Methodist perspective is that is to recognize that the emerging or the not yet created needs its own space and needs plenty of space sometimes. And one of the things that we find is sometimes quite difficult terrain. It is enabling the time-honored not to be sucking all the energy and the finance and the resources and the expectations, and giving enough space for something that's going to look very different, to have the space to just gently be nurtured and grow. So our ideal is this mixed ecology, this blended ecology, where the time-honored, the inherited is gaining insight and energy and renewed passion from what's being formed, that's new, that's fresh. But the new is gaining insight from the ancient and not becoming untethered. So it's completely rooted, within our one holy Catholic Apostolic Church, all of that, but recognizing that they do need space, that they are different forms of enterprise in a sense. And that's something that we've been playing with quite a bit, and that I try and talk about in the book, that we want that mixture, we want the blending, but they do need their space as well. So it seems to me it's quite an art form to try and live in that ecosystem and enable those habitats to grow and develop healthily.
Yeah, that leads us very nicely into the second chapter, Ed, which is about integrating a mixed ecology. So if the first chapter is a why question, why mixed ecology, this is perhaps much more of a how question. And again, you give some helpful thoughts here. You use 3 R's to talk about what is useful to see, and then you have, I think it's a journey through some garden metaphors. So I don't know if you can take my cryptic question and
build on that a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. I really sort of live in metaphors. Like my whole life is a bit of a metaphor, I think. So the start point is to share a metaphor to help to explain that. So I think you can see mixed ecology or blended ecology as just a collection of things that are sitting alongside each other. Maybe like a fruit stall or a greengrocers or whatever, or supermarket section where they're all in different boxes. Or you can see how actually you can identify their shape and their identity, but they're doing something together, like a fruit salad. So in a fruit salad, the flavors are richer together, but you can still see and taste the individual apple, orange, whatever. And the helpful analogy about fruit salad is when I was teaching online in the pandemic, I would teach on mixed ecology with our students. And we actually realized we could make fruit salads in the lecture because we were all at home, which you can't do in a lecture hall. And what was fascinating was every fruit salad was different. People cut the fruit differently. They chose different flavors. Some don't work as well as others. So the integrated mixed ecology will look different everywhere. It's a sort of ecosystem of ecosystems in that sense. But the idea is that actually maybe there are connector points between. So these 3 R's are firstly recognize or recognition. This founding block is about being really aware of what else is around you in the sort of ecclesial and missional space. It's very easy to get stuck in our denominations or, in our local networks. And, there's something in that, isn't there? But actually, there's a whole load of something else going on that's probably at our fingertips. And even if it's really different to what we would do and we don't agree with the way it's done, it's still recognizing that, okay, that is, for someone else, that is their expression of church. There may well be some boundaries of what doesn't make something church, but generally we fit in those boundaries. And the second it's resourcing. So again, the integrated ecosystem will only work if we have a sort of sharing economy or not a barter system, but a sort of more open market. A really simple example. I know people used to run a Fresh Expression that was a market stall of Fresh Expression. And I can't remember exactly how it works, but they had a stall at the weekly market and it was their way of connecting with the community and doing stuff. But they needed tables and chairs to do this. And the local inherited time-honored church had a stack of tables they didn't use on a Saturday morning. And so they lent them. Super, super simple analogy. And it's more complex in reality, but how do we just share what we have a bit more? And then the third is about resourcing. So it's about resilience, which is a key block. It's really hard to do this stuff. And it's a huge journey for everyone to go on to do it, I think. And so we need to build in levels of resilience What happens when we hit a crisis, knowing our sort of weaknesses, our Achilles heels, so we can overcome those. And actually then it cuts down all the sort of negative stuff that can probably spin quite easily. So that was one thing. And then, I created something called the Mixed Ecology Journey, which I suppose inspired by the Fresh Expressions journey in some ways, but offering a different way, an approach that you can work your way through to begin to grow this sense of integration. So really, really quickly, it starts with noticing, where you're just doing some unbiased noticing what's around. It then moves to giving, to think about what could you possibly give away. I'm going to refer to my diagram in my book for this because I always forget one. Gathering. And I found myself writing about tents, sort of really informal spaces that we can meet. So not just going to the big church down the road because they've got the biggest space, but maybe it's a cafe or a green or a community hall, just to get to know each other. Connecting are the connector points that we can actually help each other. So if someone turns up to one expression of church and actually turns out it's not for them, how good are we at saying, you know what, actually, maybe try this other type of church down the road? That's quite painful and hard to do, particularly in the narrative of scarcity. And then collaborating, if we can move to that space, doing things together. And the ultimate is co-creating. Is there a way of different church leaders from different approaches actually creating something together, but that brings a difference that could be that fruit salad?
Thanks, Ed. Leslie, anything to say in response to that?
Well, I think it's great stuff, this. I'm really enjoying listening to Ed discussing all of this. I think it's great. And, from the Methodist point of view, what I was just trying to tap into about our founding story was this ability that John Wesley had to see the both and rather than the either or, and to hold things together. That at the time other people wanted to drive apart, to say that, we can honor that which has been our tradition, but look what God is doing over there in a completely different way. And how can we join that together? So where's the sense of connection? Where's the sense of partnership that we can develop? I think, we are singing exactly from the same hymn sheet. And the wondering that I have about our Methodist movement is how our pattern and history of circuit, where groups of churches are grouped together, could actually be a really effective container for developing riches far beyond the time-honored churches that we've inherited, to saying what is there that God is doing it in different ways in tent and tabernacle, in the gathering spaces that are ours, but also in the third places that we can go and be a guest in, with partners, with folk from other denominations, so that we are just looking at a whole vast array, a fruit salad. I love that. But where can we find the places where God is doing something and celebrate that and bring that in to the ecology that's developing here? So it's good stuff.
Great. Just want to encourage and remind those who are watching or listening to this, whether you're watching a recording or whether you're watching this live, do feel free to comment on the video. If you're watching it live, we'll be able to perhaps respond to those. But if you're even watching a recording, do feel free to comment wherever you're finding this content. The third chapter, Ed, is about inhabiting a mixed ecology. And what does it mean to dwell? Or I think you used a phrase, what does it mean to have a posture of inhabitation in the context where we are? Perhaps you want to unpack that for us a bit. I know you draw on some other writing that people have done about space and place. And I think that's a really helpful thing about what does it mean to dwell in the places where we find ourselves.
Yeah, I think the idea of rootedness as well was sort of key in this thinking. And I think I was going along the lines of, if we're going to do this hard work of sharing and living alongside each other in different ways, and that difficult gifting that can be there sometimes, and accepting, we kind of, to understand the other people, we need to understand ourselves. And if the whole of the ecosystem can understand itself and kind of find its rootedness or its inhabiting, actually it makes for a much more authentic journey and conversation and partnership. So I was always really inspired by George Ling's book, The 7 Sacred Spaces, which I think he published about 4 years ago, perhaps. where he looks at the 7 monastic spaces, so things like refectory, cloister, chapel, so forth, and really argues that actually, generally, the church has got stuck in chapel mode, which is a sort of gathered, more sort of platform, stadium approach, where someone's at the front and we're sort of invited to join in. And then reflects on, more pioneering, fresh expressions approaches, which are much more in the sort of refectory space around food, conversation, or the cloister, the bit in a monastery, which was the connector space. So think of cathedrals that have cloisters. It's where informal things happen on the way from one thing to another, which is very pioneering, isn't it? Because you're alert to the spirit. And I was inspired by that to think, okay, we could use that as firstly to help church describe who they are. So by using that work, and maybe challenging the ecosystem for those in the ecosystem to think, well, perhaps I need to do more than chapel. And for those who are really, say, in refectory, maybe I need to not just do that. There's other richness to draw on. But then I also thought perhaps we could use that as a way to understand the missional context that all of our churches are in. So began to then write about how, what are the chapels of today? Like we're going to see a film or, even things sort of broadcast stuff online, even YouTube in a way is more of a chapel. We're all tuning in, we're watching, we're dispersed, but we're listening to someone talking about something. All kinds of different ways. And so by trying to understand the spaces that we are in our churches and the spaces in our communities, we begin to be more inhabited in the places that we're in, really.
Great. And Leslie, when Ed talks about that in the book, and having read your book, you talk a little bit about the streams of Methodist tradition of holiness, of grace and gospel. And there were some resonances there for me, sort of comparing those two things. I wonder what your thoughts are.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was trying to do my own observations around how we as Methodists have become very chapel-centric, and the Sunday morning at 10:30 all gathered together has become the main and dominant mode, when actually my reflection on John Wesley and the founding story of us as a movement was actually the extraordinary way in which John Wesley was able to make grace the central feature of what was going on. So as I talk about in the book, he created different spaces for grace effectively. So he was out in the field, proclaiming the good news, enabling people to respond, prevenient grace in the ascendancy in that point. But he knew that if he just offered Jesus to the crowds and they responded, but then he had nothing for them afterwards, then he might as well have, he said he'd have been better not doing that at all, actually, because he just created a vacuum. So what he very quickly recognized was that he needed to create other spaces for grace. So the band, the small group of people, the class, and then the society meeting where people could grow in grace. And grace was the real hallmark, I think, of that rise of the movement, that people were open to grace and they were responsible in seeking to grow in grace. So the thing that I try and talk about in the book is about creating spaces for grace. And they can be of all sorts of different ways as long as our focus is on how can we be opening ourselves to what God is wanting to do in our lives, in our community together as we grow in grace, grow in holiness. And so, yeah, there's loads of crossovers, I think, into all of that stuff that Ed's talking about there. And for me, within the Methodist movement, just that refocusing on saying that there's a whole range of ways in which we can grow as God's people and we can be missional as God's people. If we're open to God's grace and see that as the resource that we need above all else. I sometimes say within our Methodist world, we're so anxious about running out of money, running out of time, running out of resources, running out of people. We're so anxious. We are an anxious church. The one thing we'll never run out of is God's grace. God's grace is always going to be available to us. And if we can just focus on being open to God's grace, to seeing what God's grace is doing amongst us, in spaces of grace, then all things become possible for us and all things become possible for our mission, I think.
Yeah. And the diversity in the way that grace is ministered or expressed in all those different places that we're inhabiting, that Ed was talking about, it's really, really interesting there. The next chapter, Ed, you talk about leading a mixed ecology. and particularly, and sometimes it's where the rubber hits the road. Okay, it's all good talking about this and having these wonderful metaphors, but how do you implement this? And you talk a little bit about the different roles for those who are leading, those who are leading in a way that they are pioneering, but also those that have a role, a different type of leadership role, which is sort of an oversight role. And do you want to sort of expand a bit about that and sort of leadership in general in the mixed ecology?
So I think perhaps it's good to zone in on what we might call the mixed ecology minister now, which I think is a phrase I might have coined actually in an article in the Church Times, but I'm running with it. In the sense that there might be people who are called to do different things at the same time. So someone leading a traditional or a time-honored expression of church, and they're running a cafe church or a messy church. They're doing BCP, 8 o'clock communion in the morning. They're running some kind of drop-in thing in the afternoon. And so it might be, you're a practitioner within the mixed ecology. So you're wanting to lead out of both the spaces, and you're really interested in the connection between the two. And I think I'm a mixed ecology minister. I love some cathedral worship and beautiful choral music, but I also love thinking of amazing kind of crazy off the wall digital things, or, experimenting or whatever. So there's something about that, is that there are people around, and for years and years, people have been doing that. It's not a new thing, but again, naming it might give people more agency and permission to do that. But I think there are others who, perhaps they're the leaders of the existing churches in parishes, in dioceses, in circuits, wherever you'll find them, who are not necessarily called to step into the planting or pioneering role, but they're brilliant at the time-honored space, and they need to keep doing that. But actually, they're the permission givers who can release the people, again, often lay people in their churches or areas, who then need to go and be a pioneer, be a planter, start a fresh expression. So the two things, and the people who kind of hold it together all at the same time. Then there's the overseers who would give permission, but then you've got the practitioners in those overseer spaces. So the overseer's role there is to spot them, help them if they've got, or signpost them to training or vocation things to help people understand their role or their calling, and then allow them to do it, which then leads us all into things like the gifting and the resourcing and the noticing. It all kind of enters into that space. So in this chapter, I also was writing about 4 different questions people could ask themselves. What's their why? Where are they called in that four-way axis we talked about earlier? How are they going to approach things? They're really drawing on the pioneer spectrum of sort of replication, adapting, innovating, but also I added in curating. Sometimes it's about being, particularly inherited language, being given what you've been passed on, doing something brilliant with it, growing it, and then you might pass it on to the next person. Understanding your what, so, what kinds of things are you called to start, and then thinking about where you're rooted, which gets a bit more complex. But, are you there for a short amount of time or a long time? So I think it's just recognizing there are lots and lots of different types of leaders in the ecosystem. And again, it's important to recognize that.
Yeah. I love the language of co-creative leadership, which you sort of coin in the chapter as well. And that sense of, we often think about singular leaders, but the fact that sort of leadership sits in different places and that we are called to create with people, not do stuff to people, I think is really, really interesting. And I won't ask you about it now, but I'll point people back to the shop, freshexpressions.org.uk/shop, where you can get a copy of the book. Because you talk about launching and landing and some other sort of useful things that people will be able to take and practically implement, or at least be inspired by as they work. Listen, any thoughts? I know you wrote a chapter on leadership in your book. Revive us again.
Yeah, I did. And I think, the Methodist Church has got a rather interesting history really about what it's done with leadership. We started out as primarily a lay leadership, where that was one of the extraordinary things about the early Methodist movement, this explosion of lay leadership from often the working classes and the mobilization of them effectively. And then gradually over time, that leadership has been professionalized and become much more invested now in its ordained ministry, with a slight less lack of confidence, we might say, in our lay leadership. And I was arguing really for a retilting back of that, so that the local lay ministry can be key again. And that role of oversight that Ed refers to, that role of oversight in circuit ministry, can be about equipping, enabling some co-creation, imagining, advocating for all of that stuff that desperately needs to happen, I think, to see that explosion of lay ministry, which I believe is Methodist's best future and the best contribution we can play to the wider church, actually. So, yeah, I think, it's a really interesting story that the Methodist Church has been on. And I'm just encouraging us to have a look back at how it was when it was a real growing movement and say, hey, let's just have a look at all that again.
Yeah. I think it's a hopeful conversation we're having, which is really, and I do think this conversation about mixed ecology, it's not, it sort of says, let's take the best of the new and the time honored. It's about refining and renewing and rediscovering the sort of original charisms, and sort of putting them in a way that's relevant to today. And I'm always hopeful as we have these sorts of conversations about what the church is and could become. Just one more chapter, Ed, which was shaping a mixed ecology. And you said you were a metaphor type of guy, and there's a metaphor that you used here, which you used to talk about what it means to shape a mixed ecology. And it's a metaphor of a reserve. So I think you might have to explain that to us as you explain what does it mean to shape a mixed ecology in the context where we are.
When I was a parish priest in London, we had a nature reserve right in the parish, right next to where we lived. And I was part of a team who were trying to it all got overgrown to sort of help it to get back to what it needed to be. So that was in my mind. So yeah, we're using the analogy of a nature reserve. It was trying to think about not so much how do we grow the experiences of churches, but how do we grow the idea in reality of the mixed ecologies. It's a slightly different spin. So really, there are 5 things. So you need the seeds, you need new things to grow. So those are the visionaries. You need the people who often are at the edges of life, aren't they? Who've got the ideas that perhaps people don't listen to very much, but they're the prophetic, the sentinels. They need to be there. That someone needs to spark the idea. But that in itself is just, nothing's going to happen if that's all that is there. So then you need something to create the boundary around the reserve, don't you, in a nature reserve, that marks it out as something special. You can't build on it. You can't put paths through the middle of it. You can't play football. And similarly, we need to protect these spaces so that others don't trample through them and just sort of destroy what's emerging. So the next thing you need are supporters. They're not necessarily doing the work, but they're there to sort of hold the line, provide money, permission, that kind of stuff. Then you need the pollinators, the kind of bees, as things start to grow. These are the sort of advocates. So they might be similar to visionaries, but they've caught the vision and they're excited and they're just spreading it everywhere. They're the people who like to chat. They pass it on, and it begins to filter through the community. Then I think you might, in this analogy, you might need a beehive, the place of resourcing. So you might need facilitators. So people who are perhaps coaches, who are really good at helping people think through, okay, we've got this great idea. We've all got on board, some of us anyway. How are we going to make this happen? What do we need to do? What are the next steps? They're pretty key. It's quite practical. And then lastly, fifthly, you've got the practitioners, the people who are actually leading churches, starting churches, but they're living out, they're embodying, inhabiting the mixed ecology, maybe as an overseer, practitioner, mixed ecology minister, or whatever. And so, it's still quite theoretical because no one's really done it. So it's a bit pie in the sky, but it'd be great. The next level is people to test it and do it and then do some research. But the combination of those things, I think, help it to grow. It just won't happen on its own. It's too big a journey just to suddenly happen. So I think these 5 things might help it to do that.
Yeah, that's great. I love the energy in that image of the nature reserve. I was in a conference recently and they got in a museum curator And we're sort of, what can we, when you bring two people from completely different contexts to see what we can learn, it was like, what can we learn in the pioneering church context from people who curate museums? And there's an interesting question about what is it that we want to hold on to remember from the past, and that what's most important. How do we prioritize what we've got in order to make those prominent? So there were some really positive connections, but the idea of a museum and church sort of, it fills me with dread in terms of, well, we don't want a museum, but what we do want is to preserve something, but to preserve something that continues to enable and to be a space that gives life and energy and creativity. And so that imagery of the nature reserve, I think, is a really positive one and helpful one to think about in terms of church. Leslie, how do you respond to that? And are there any thoughts?
No, it's great. Yeah, it's great. I was just thinking about I refer in the book to the danger that we've had as the church of sometimes thinking we can re-engineer our way forward. If we just get another initiative out and it'll be okay and the machine will work better and all the rest of it. And actually we need to be remissioning ourselves and that sense of knowing our why, what we're about here. And why we are a community and why we're here is absolutely key. And I think then, as you were talking about that nature reserve, it was just coming to me again, that thought that I have for our circuit being that container. I've sometimes described my dream of the circuit as being providing a canopy and a safety net within which all manner of things can flourish. And you've described it so eloquently in terms of what might be helpful to have within that canopy and the safety net. But I think we're aspiring and dreaming of the same sort of thing, this creative space where all sorts of things are emerging and feeding into each other and being encouraged and it just, to me, it's just such a wonderful image of what could be. But it's not to be engineered by us by coming up with an initiative. I think it is about something for us to be co-creating and ever so sensitive to what God's Spirit is seeming to do in our midst and being prompted by that.
And just to add to that, I think Steve Aistop's book, Rewilding the Church, which I also referred to, is actually enough, isn't it? It's letting it unfold and not over-engineering it.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I was in a conversation the other day about woodland and the nature of you talked about the canopy, Leslie, and the sort of the forest floor. And we need to be paying attention to what new life is emerging on the forest floor if the forest is going to survive when those older trees fall. But the existence of those older trees does provide protection and also the resource for that new life to flourish. There's as a visual image, that woodland with ferns on the forest floor, and just as we talk about mixed ecology, that part of what comes to my mind. We often think about gardens, but actually that sort of natural space. I'm just going to. We've had one question from a watcher or listener. I'm going to show that on the screen, and then I'm going to come to you after we've looked at Tim's question. To any final thoughts as we wrap our conversation up. But Tim Yao asked a question, reflecting on Ling's 7 spaces, where does mission, leaving, being sent and pioneering fit into the spaces? I don't know if that's something you can think about, Ed.
Well, I think pioneering fits into it, like we already said. I think you see often pioneers in the cloister space, refectory. I think mission is in all of it, in the sense, isn't it, that mission should be involved in all of those different things. That library or scriptorium is also an interesting one. It's not just academia. It's about knowledge, wisdom, digging into God. There's also the sense of cell, which is probably one of the hardest, I think, for people, where you're on your own. It's where you wrestle with the tough places. And so I think the sense of, the pioneer needing to be in the cell sometimes pioneers we're all out and about because we're active, busy, ideas people. But I think the cell might be the thing that gives the fuel, to to mission, to being sent out. So I think that it's attempting to think of it as a monastery where it's all in a walled community, but that's not the idea of the analogies. It's describing being in the world. So, the cloister is your local town centre, the swimming pool, the service station on your way into, we always bump into the same person. It's the in-between. So I think it's stretching it, seeing it as mapping your community rather than within a walled community.
Yeah. Anything to add to that, Leslie? Or?
No, I don't think I have really. No, that's helpful as it is. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I'm thinking recently about the cell and how I like many pioneers are quite activist in nature, and can run after one shiny thing after another. And I think for me, the cell is a space of contemplation, of consideration, of reflection, to make sure that what I'm doing is aligned with what God's calling me into and the places he's needing me to be. So I think, for me, that cell is, I think many pioneers, that is a sort of reflective space that we need to inhabit if we're not just going to, we can create for the sake of creation rather than being obedient to the call of God on us. We had another question. I'll take the one more, and then we will wrap up with some fun thoughts. Hey, Ben, when thinking about making space for the new so that mixed ecology can thrive and flourish, how critical is developing a trust bridge between legacy and the founding, inherited, and pioneering? And Ben's posted a secondary question. He's just got in there. What might a trust bridge look like in a clerical institution? I'll leave. Any thoughts there?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that the journey, those 6 stages of the journey, is the trust bridge. It takes time to build a trust bridge. So I think in working through those stages, I think, did you catch what I said? I might have cut out for a second. The journey, the fresh expression, the mixed ecology journey is the trust bridge, I think. I think working it through allows that to grow. But I think, I finished the book by talking about institutions and the need for people to catch the vision and to give permission for this. So I think it can be difficult. And that's where the nature reserve is helpful, not in any way to run down institutions, because I think they absolutely have their place. But sometimes the institution can try and take stuff, make it, over-promote it, have too many expectations, overload things, or ignore them. And I think the boundary keeps it safe. And that, in putting it in place, can also help to build a bit of trust. It's a good question.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's this tension, and I think you talk about it in your book as well, Leslie, about when you talk about rejuvenating a movement and also going back to the faith, and how do we have this sense of movement and of church, this sort of, those two things. We've got, I don't know if you've got any final thoughts. We're coming into this sort of close now. So any final thoughts about the conversation that we've been having?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that sense of trust, trust is absolutely key, isn't it? And trust that's founded on always being clear about our why. Why are we? And who is God at calling us to be? Which is beyond, am I in a time-honored or am I in a pioneering place? Who is God calling us to be and why? Seems to me fundamental questions. And if we all have that shared value and understanding about that, and then we can start to articulate more clearly about the different enterprises that perhaps we're part of that are seeking to flourish and become blended. So I think having people who can speak the language and translate across is absolutely key, because often pioneers get stuck, I think, in not being able to know how to speak to the time-honored and vice versa. So it needs the translators in the middle, I think. I don't want to oversimplify it. I think what Ed's done is fantastic in terms of, giving a lot of nuance to all of this. But I think those translators who can advocate across is really key as well.
Final thoughts, Ed?
Final thoughts. I think, like I said before, I think when I was writing this, I felt it was quite aspirational, and there weren't that many examples. I mean, there are a few, but there was a limited number of examples of this in action. So I guess my final thought is for not about this book, but about, it'd be wonderful if people using the work of Leslie and others and me as well could catch the vision and start to see where the connections are between and celebrate the difference, which can be hard. But that could change our narrative of scarcity into a narrative of abundance, which is a much more reshaped narrative and is a trusting narrative, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And just as you say that, I'm thinking actually we've had 15, 20 years of pioneers sort of finding their voice, and building confidence. And in a way, some of them have had to find a space beyond the church in order to grow in that confidence. But I think actually bringing that confidence back into the conversation within the church, creating this space for mixed ecology where they know who they are and they know what they can bring into the church, I think I'd love to see mixed ecology growing up. In the Baptist context that I inhabit, I would love to see more of that where, the local church becomes an umbrella for all sorts of creative possibility, or a nature reserve for all sorts of new life to emerge. I think pioneers have a lot to offer, but we need to recognize that we need one another. The church needs the pioneers and the pioneers need the church. Great place to end. We've got future author conversations coming up. So do look elsewhere on our social and on our website to find out details of those, or to catch one of the previous author conversations. But Leslie and Ed, thank you very much. And don't forget to pick up one of the books, or perhaps both of them, and have a good read. Bless you. Take care. See you again.